The battlefield roared with plasma fire and the screams of dying ships. But in the heart of the chaos, a different kind of weapon was deployed. Not metal and fire, but paper and ink. A single human vessel, armed with nothing but lawyers, dared to challenge the very nature of war. They didn't fight the enemy, they sued them. And in a galaxy that understood only power, the humans were about to prove that sometimes the most devastating force isn't a broadside, but a subpoena. Please wait. Before we start, tap that iCard button in the top right corner and smash that subscribe button right now. Hit the notification bell so you're first in line when new stories land. All right, let's dive into the story. The silence aboard the HLS Subpoena was heavier than the void outside. Ike. 3 hours before the Galactic Council fleet scattered like startled dust motes, Commander Eris Bellows stood at the bridge viewport. The cool metal floor, a stark contrast to the fiery ballet unfolding in the distance. Plasma beams stitched jagged lines across the darkness, and the guttural roar of distant broadsides vibrated faintly through the deck plates. This wasn't the glorious conflict depicted in recruiting posters. This was a brutal, messy brawl for a planet nobody on Earth had ever heard of until a few weeks ago. Ultraxis 3 is a dust-choked world currently being ripped apart by the Galactic Council and the Dust Ark Separatists. Eris watched a Kralian heavy cruiser, a vessel built for brute force, blossom into 1,000 smaller, burning pieces. It died with a silent, terrible grace in the vacuum. "That's the 4th ship down," she murmured, the words flat in the hushed control room. Didn't even last through their opening volley. Across the bridge, oblivious to the unfolding catastrophe, sat Lieutenant Silas Greaves, the subpoena's legal officer. He was a man who seemed to exist in a perpetual state of calm, even when the universe was tearing itself apart around him. He held a mug reinforced to withstand the occasional unexpected jolt, emblazoned with the words "lawsuit pending." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea, a fragrant, earthy blend that always seemed out of place amidst the sterile technology of the ship. Technically, their targeting sequence violated interstellar emission standards, Greaves said, his voice conversational, almost serene. He didn't look up from the datapad in his hands. Improper shield modulation rates. Someone could bring that up. Eris turned, fixing him with a steady gaze. Greaves was younger than her by a decade, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a mind that seemed to process the universe through the lens of case law and procedural loopholes. He had a habit of adjusting the cuffs of his immaculately pressed uniform, even in the middle of a crisis. "Greaves," she said, her voice low. "Yes, Commander." He finally looked up, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his lips. "Can we do the thing?" Greaves blinked slowly, the movement deliberate, theatrical. He set his mug down on a nearby console with exaggerated care, the ceramic clicking softly against the metal. "Are you referring to the thing?" Eris nodded once, a firm, decisive movement. Greaves' smile widened, the kind of expression a predator might wear when it spots a particularly vulnerable target in the herd. It was a chilling look at a man who spent his days buried in legal texts. "I'll need 5 minutes in a torpedo tube." Eris turned to her helmsman, a young woman named Priya Shah, whose knuckles were white on the controls. "Battlefield status." Priya's voice was tight with tension. "GC losses mounting? Outer defense lines compromised? 2 enemy dreadnoughts were incoming? 1 holding position." "Flagship class." "Good," Eris said, a plan forming in her mind, a plan that was utterly insane, utterly human, and utterly reliant on the man who was currently checking his tie in the reflection of a darkened monitor. "Lock onto the flagship." Priya hesitated. "Ma'am, we're going to sue them." Eris met her gaze, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. "Exactly." The battle raged outside, a symphony of destruction, but inside the subpoena, a different kind of weapon was being readied. One forged not in the fires of war, but in the quiet halls of bureaucracy. And for the first time since the fighting began, Eris felt a strange, unsettling sense of hope. In the subpoena's modest launch bay, the air hummed with a nervous energy that was a stark contrast to the usual quiet. 2 deckhands, Marcus Vey and Lena Cole, stared at the modified courier torpedo with a mixture of reverence and disbelief. It was painted regulation gray, unremarkable save for the bright orange stripe that slashed down its center, bearing the words "Service Delivery." legal priority in large block letters. It looked less like a weapon and more like a particularly aggressive piece of mail. "You ever fired one of these before?" Marcus asked, running a gloved hand along the torpedo's smooth casing. His voice was hushed, as if speaking too loudly might break the strange spell. Lena, a woman whose scarred knuckles betrayed years of tinkering with delicate machinery, shook her head. "Nope. Didn't even think they were real." "They weren't," Marcus confirmed, until Greaves petitioned EarthGov to make them a line item. Said it was a crucial component of non-kinetic conflict resolution. He chuckled, a short, dry sound. We all thought he was crazy. Inside the torpedo, nestled amongst the complex guidance systems, were the true payloads. 3 sealed, physical copies of a ceasefire petition, a full arbitration request packet, 12 notarized exhibits, and an animated 3D presentation designed to explain complex legal arguments to species with vastly different cognitive structures. The torpedo's outer casing also housed a small, high-definition camera drone and a surprisingly powerful loudspeaker. It was a legal office compressed into a missile. Back on the bridge, Greaves was making the final adjustments to the torpedo's targeting parameters. He hummed softly to himself, a cheerful off-key tune that grated on Eris's nerves. He seemed entirely unconcerned by the explosions that still punctuated the distance. "Commander," he announced, his voice clear and crisp, "activating Article 97.312 of the Interstellar Conflict Charter, Tactical Litigation Protocol." A soft ping echoed across the ship's systems, a gentle chime that felt profoundly out of place in a war zone. On internal screens, 100 lines of legal precedent began scrolling, a cascade of dense text that would make even a seasoned lawyer's eyes water. Eris glanced over, her expression a mixture of exasperation and grudging admiration. Confirmation. Article verified. Fied. Clauses buried in the GC legal code between environmental dust mitigation during conflict and fleet uniform coloration standards. Greaves explained cheerfully, "It's a nightmare to find. Technically, it shouldn't exist, but it does. And we filed it under procedural emergency 5 years ago." Quote, "Just in case." "Just in case of what?" Eris muttered. "Just in case we ever needed to sue someone in the middle of a battle," Greaves replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He tapped a final command into his console. "Launch it." Launching lawsuit," Priya announced, her voice still tinged with disbelief. The torpedo shot from the Subpoena's launch bay with a small, almost apologetic puff of inert gas. It traveled unimpeded through the chaos of battle, its transponder flashing a non-combat delivery code. Most sensors ignored it, assuming it was debris or a broken drone. It was a tiny, absurd arrow aimed at the heart of a galactic conflict, carrying not destruction, but paperwork. And as it streaked towards the enemy flagship, Eris Bellows couldn't help but wonder if they had finally, truly lost their minds. The vacuum of space seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what legal chaos the humans would unleash. The torpedo impacted the enemy flagship with a soft, almost comical thunk. Aboard the separatist vessel, the Iron Will, Captain Geel, a 4-eyed, triple-mandibled veteran of the Dust Ark's original uprising, felt the vibration and immediately barked an order for a damage report. His voice was a low growl, a sound honed by decades of conflict. "No damage, Commander," came the confused reply from his bridge crew. It's some kind of pod." The hull camera feed flickered onto Geel's main view screen, showing the torpedo's shell opening like a mechanical flower, petals of gray metal peeling back. The camera drone rose up slowly, turning directly towards the command deck with a steady red recording light. Then the speaker crackled to life, a cheerful, disembodied voice cutting through the tense silence of the bridge. "You have been served," it announced, first in Galactic Standard, then repeating the phrase in 5 other major languages, each delivered with the same unnerving politeness. The camera drone then deployed a hard-copy document tube, a clear cylinder containing neatly rolled parchment. A small propulsion unit gently pressed it against the flagship's view window with a wet thap, sticking there like a particularly stubborn fly. There was a long silence on the bridge of the Iron Will, a silence born of utter bewilderment. Geel stared at the document pressed to the window. It was visibly signed in blue ink. He could even make out tiny glitter flecks in the header. It was absurd. It was impossible. What Gil finally said, the word not a question, but an expression. But an expression of soul-deep disorientation. It appears we've been served a lawsuit, the flagship's communications officer said, his voice trembling slightly. From the humans. Gil turned to his legal officer, Magistrate Care, a long-suffering separatist bureaucrat in full-body armor who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Is this real? Magistrate Care's voice was small, filled with the weary dread of a man who had seen too much paperwork. Unfortunately, yes. Far from the chaos and confusion on the bridge of the Iron Will aboard the HLS Subpoena, Greaves sipped his tea again and smiled. Service confirmed, he said, a quiet satisfaction in his tone. Now the fun begins. He adjusted his glasses, though Eris suspected he didn't actually need them. There was a glint in his eye that she had come to recognize the look of a man who was about to unleash bureaucratic hell on an unsuspecting universe. The battle outside had paused, held in a strange, surreal stasis by a piece of paper and a cheerful, disembodied voice. The weight of interstellar law wielded by a single human vessel had brought two warring fleets to a standstill. And the true power of the subpoena, Eris realized, wasn't in its weapons, but in its filing cabinets. Aboard the Galactic Council flagship Integrity's Wrath, Admiral Nethin was midway through shouting orders, her voice a guttural roar that usually commanded immediate obedience. The bridge was a maelstrom of flashing lights and frantic report. Then her aide, a young officer with antennae that twitched nervously, gingerly handed her a datapad. "It's from the human vessel," he said, his voice barely audible above the din. "We're in combat," Nethin snapped, her four eyes narrowed in fury. What could they possibly want? "Yes, Admiral," the aide replied, his antennae drooping. "And yet the human vessel has submitted an official arbitration claim under Article 97.312. Nethin squinted at the datapad. "That's not a real number." "It is, ma'am," the aide insisted, his voice gaining a touch of bewildered conviction. "It's buried under Fleet Code Section 17, Conflict Mitigation and Nonviolent Recourse, Subsection J." "Subsection J," Nethin repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "J as in?" "Judicial?" "Yes, Admiral." Nethin stared at him, then at the datapad, then back at the unfolding battle on the main screen. Half the fleet was smoldering wreckage. Damage reports scrolled in red across the holographic displays, and the enemy flagship, the Iron Will, had just stopped. Not powered down, not retreating, just paused, like a child caught red-handed in the act of stealing a cookie. "You're telling me," Nethin said, her voice dangerously low, "in the middle of a siege, the humans have filed a lawsuit?" "Yes, Admiral," the aide confirmed, his antennae twitching uncontrollably now. "And we are legally required to acknowledge it. And cease offensive operations until the matter is resolved in arbitration." A long silence followed, broken only by the crackle of damaged comms. Nethin looked around the bridge at the faces of her officers, a mixture of shock and utter confusion. Then, quietly, she said, "Someone put a plasma round through that charter the next time we print it." In the combat zone, the chaos settled into a surreal, bureaucratic stillness. Missiles that had already launched were allowed to finish their arc, detonating harmlessly in the void. Lasers were powered down with awkward, almost apologetic timing. A separatist cruiser drifted past a GC corvette, both visibly on fire, both crews pretending not to notice the other. It was the most passive-aggressive ceasefire in galactic history. Aboard the Subpoena, while the fleets idled and lawyers prepared for battle, the crew got to work. A damage control team patched the starboard hull with emergency plating, listed in the arbitration filing as structural integrity stabilization for impartial observation integrity. 3 shuttles arrived carrying legal observation units, which happened to include a suspicious number of Marines in crisp suits and dark sunglasses. A comms officer quietly uploaded a fake zoning update to GC Fleet Command, rerouting an entire battle group away from the area for legal neutrality enforcement. The aliens noticed. They just couldn't do anything about it. The hidden detail, subtle as a whisper in a hurricane, was the ease with which the Subpoena crew manipulated established protocols, twisting them to their advantage under the guise of legal procedure. They weren't just observing, they were actively shaping the conflict, not with weapons, but with loopholes. Inside the subpoena's modified escape shuttle, which had been transformed into a surprisingly comfortable arbitration pod with faux wood paneling and soft lighting, Silas Greaves felt entirely in his element. He now wore a crisp black suit, a silver tie that caught the light, and reading glasses he absolutely did not need but felt completed the look. The pod was gently pushed from the docking bay, hovering between the two idling fleets in what the humans cheerfully referred to as the litigation buffer zone. A camera drone orbited the pod slowly, broadcasting the hearing in high definition across both fleets and back to Galactic Council headquarters, initiating formal proceedings under Interstellar Judicial Arbitration, Emergency Protocol 97.312. Greaves said smoothly, his voice calm and authoritative. Greaves, Lieutenant, bar certified in 12 sectors representing humanity, presenting to the Council, aligned forces, and whatever dusty legality the Separatists cling to. On the split screen opposite him appeared Magistrate Care, the Separatist legal officer. He still wore his traditional armor and ceremonial robes, but the armor looked rumpled and his mandibles twitched with visible frustration. He had the unmistakable haunted look of someone who had just realized law school would not prepare him for this. "I formally protest these proceedings," Care growled, his voice a low rumble. "This is an abusive process." "You're absolutely right," Greaves replied cheerfully, a wide, disarming smile on his face, "but that doesn't make it illegal." Care sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of entire star systems. "Proceed." Greaves launched into his opening arguments like a showman with a deep personal grudge against improper zoning. "Your siege violates zoning regulation 441.8. Orbital to surface military enforcement requires a permit filed through Sectoral Zoning Agency Alpha 5. None was received. In addition, your plasma bombardment trajectory crossed into a civilian-aligned orbital corridor. Case precedent Vernick v. Outer Transit Authority, if you'd care to look it up." Care blinked, his 4 eyes wide with disbelief. Greaves continued without mercy, his voice picking up speed and intensity. "Let's not forget the environmental impact. Ultraxis 3 is technically a Category 7 protected microbiome. Every one of your debris fields violates the Planetary Clean Atmosphere Initiative. I'm estimating 3.2 million credits in fines, not including punitive damages. You're making this up." Care sputtered, his mandibles clacking together. "Am I?" Greaves transmitted a 300-page document, complete with annotations, footnotes, and at least 3 references to long-lost colony jurisprudence involving invasive moss. The hidden detail, a thread woven through the narrative, was the sheer, overwhelming volume and obscurity of the legal documents Greaves wielded. He wasn't just finding loopholes. He was creating new legal precedents out of thin air and ancient, forgotten laws. Care paused, scrolling through the transmitted document with a look of growing horror. "That last one is from the asteroid belt mining dispute of 2017. I thought that was purged from the archives." "Still precedent," Greaves said, adjusting his tie. "Also applicable under orbital salvage law." He leaned back in his chair, a picture of relaxed confidence. The suspense wasn't about who would fire the next shot, but about what obscure legal technicality Greaves would pull out of his hat next. The fate of a planet, and perhaps the balance of power in the sector, rested not on firepower, but on footnotes. Back on the subpoena, while the fleets idled and lawyers argued over invasive moss and zoning violations, the crew continued their quiet work. The legal observation units, the Marines in suits and sunglasses, moved with a silent efficiency, securing key points on the ship and ensuring no unauthorized personnel could disrupt the arbitration. Lena Cole and Marcus Vey, the deckhands who had launched the lawsuit torpedo, were now busy rerouting power to the ship's long-range comms, establishing a direct, encrypted link with EarthGov. Inside Integrity's Wrath, Admiral Nethin was pacing like a warhound in a cage, her antennae A practically vibrating with frustration. She watched the live feed of the arbitration, her expression a thunderous storm. "We're being played," she said, watching as human reinforcements disguised as legal support docked with a subpoena under the cover of non-aggressive procedural flags. "Yes, Admiral," her aide replied, his voice weary, "but they're playing by the rules they invented That's the worst part, Nethan muttered, slamming a fist onto a console. Several GCZ officers had already collapsed from administrative strain. One had filed a personal ethics complaint against reality itself, citing gross negligence in the application of fundamental universal principles. On screen, Greaves paused to sip water, his movements unhurried. He then smiled, a genuinely pleasant expression that somehow made him even more infuriated. As a gesture of compromise, humanity proposes a ceasefire until the Council's Legal Oversight Committee can complete full review. Standard timeline is 7 to 10 years. Magistrate Care's eye twitched. He looked like a man who had read too much and slept too little. His ceremonial robes were rumpled, his mandibles twitched uncontrollably. At some point, he had removed his armored pauldrons and replaced them with a neck pillow. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious," Greaves said, "especially when I'm winning." The arbitration paused. Care demanded a recess to review case law, his voice bordering on a plea. Greaves used the break to adjust his tie and upload a legal meme to the GC Judicial Archive titled, "Don't start a war you can't sue your way out of." The camera drone hovered a little closer, its red light blinking. He smiled at it, a confident, almost predatory smile. Next round's going to be fun. The recess lasted 20 minutes of frantic legal research on both sides. When the screen reactivated, Magistrate Care looked even more haggard. Greaves, by contrast, looked freshly caffeinated and annoyingly chipper. He'd changed ties. This one had tiny gavel patterns and changed colors depending on the viewing angle. "Are you ready to proceed?" he asked cheerfully. The tension was palpable. Not the tension of impending battle, but the dread of an unfavorable legal ruling. The stakes were higher than ever, and the weapon was a briefcase. Magistrate Care sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the accumulated legal woes of the entire Separatist alliance. "I have reviewed the filings," he spoke slowly, each word an effort. "While your claims are legally aggressive, overly interpretive, and frankly bordering on parody, they are technically valid." "I'll take that as a compliment," Greaves said, a hint of amusement in his voice. The Separatist Alliance is willing to consider a resolution if it prevents us from further entanglement in this farce." Care's gaze narrowed, fixed on Greaves. "Excellent." Greaves leaned forward, his expression the kind normally reserved for chess masters about to pull off something smug and irreversible. "Humanity proposes a formal ceasefire, mutually binding, pending full review by the Galactic Council Legal Oversight Committee." Care's face twitched. "You mean the review board that hasn't met in over a decade and currently has a 4-year backlog?" "Correct," Greaves said, nodding. "The one whose chair died 2 years ago and has not been replaced?" "Also correct." Greaves' smile was gentle now, almost kind, which made it all the more terrifying. Care's gaze narrowed further. "And you expect us to honor this agreement while that committee deliberates?" "Why, yes," Greaves said, almost gently. "Because if you don't, then all this glorious documentation becomes actionable, and we would have no choice but to initiate a follow-up case for breach of peace arbitration compliance." He paused, then added helpfully, "and possibly wrongful orbital trauma." There was a long silence. Care looked at his data pad, then at the camera drone, then back at Greaves. The weight of bureaucracy, of endless appeals and crippling fines settled heavily on his shoulders. "We accept," he finally muttered, the words torn from him. "Lovely." Greaves smiled. "I'll transmit the confirmation packet. Don't worry, I've simplified the language down to a mere 87 pages." Back on the subpoena, Commander Eris Bellows sat in her chair, watching the proceedings with a drink in hand and a visible mix of admiration and mild concern. "Did he just win the siege with a cease and desist letter?" "Yes, ma'am," replied her XO, a stoic officer named Ben Carter, without firing a shot. Eris exhaled slowly, a shaky breath that carried the weight of the past few hours. "Fantastic. Remind me to write him up for conduct on becoming a naval officer." "Understood." The ceasefire transmission pinged across fleet systems. All combat operations immediately halted, pending judicial clarification. The Separatist ships began backing off with what could only be described as dignified retreat. Except for the one corvette that accidentally hit a legal boy and had to file a property damage waiver before it could leave. GC fleet forces reclaimed orbit over Ultraxis 3. The planet's strategic positions were re-established. Orbital authority was handed back to the planetary governor, a small, overwhelmed individual who signed the paperwork in a daze and immediately requested a transfer to somewhere less surreal, like a black hole. The subpoena systems logged the mission as successfully resolved through alternative engagement methodology. Greaves returned to the bridge still wearing his tie, now loosened slightly and holding a celebration donut. Eris stared at him. "You're impossible." "Legally speaking," Greaves said around a bite of donut, crumbs clinging to his chin, "I'm an asset." Later that week, the Galactic Council held an emergency closed session review. It was the fifth one that quarter, prompted by human operational irregularities. After 14 hours of heated debate, caffeine injections, and at least one ambassador threatening to defect to a silent monastery, the Council passed Amendment 62A, which read, Article 97.312 may only be invoked during live combat if accompanied by dual notary confirmation, one of whom must be certified sane by a neutral species authority. The vote passed unanimously with the exception of the human delegation, who abstained on the grounds that the phrase certified sane was culturally discriminatory. 2 weeks later, EarthGov quietly announced the formation of Legal Warfare Doctrine Unit 1, a specialized task group trained in high-risk battlefield arbitration and procedural conflict suppression. Recruitment requirements included JD equivalent tactical awareness and a flair for the dramatic. The hidden detail, the true terrifying culmination of the plot, was revealed in a final memo found in the GC fleet logs 3 days after the incident. It was short, encrypted, and buried in the footer of a charter revision draft. Subject: RI Article 97.312 Emergency Use Protocols. Body, please, for the love of the stars, never let the humans do that again. Attachment: Charter Revision Draft 7.1, hidden footer, encrypted. Subpoena wins again. Regards, Lieutenant Greaves. The humans hadn't just won a battle. They had weaponized bureaucracy, and the galaxy would never be the same. The chilling truth was that the subpoena's real mission wasn't observation. It was infiltration and exploitation of alien legal systems, setting the stage for a new kind of human expansion, one based not on conquest, but on contracts and court dates. And that was the end of the story. Comment below if you want the next chapter, and hit that like button. Please subscribe, turn on the bell, and as always, keep the last light burning.